Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm so happy to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Maria Go-Right-Tenandia. And just to give you a snippet of her background, Maria has over 20 years experience in business and senior management with clients in both the United States and Latin America. She also has experience as an expat entrepreneur establishing her own consulting firm in Mexico that offers services in cross-cultural training and coaching, global team management, diversity and inclusion, and leadership business competencies. She was a professor at Monterey Tech University for almost 10 years, teaching courses in intercultural communications, intercultural or international negotiations, and doing business in the global marketplace. And on top of all of that, she also speaks multiple languages, including Portuguese, French, and Italian. So we are to have her this morning. Thank you, Maria. You can take it from here.
Thank you, Andy. I let those of you know that weren't here on Tuesday that I have sent the PowerPoints and a bibliography and resource guide to Andy, which I'm sure she'll be letting all of you have a copy of, and just so that you know that you don't have to worry. There's you don't have to take notes or anything. If you're interested in more information, it'll be coming to you. So anyhow. I'll introduce myself again because I'm sure that there's some people who weren't with us on Tuesday. So I'm Maria Go-Right-Tenandia. The last name is a little long. It's a Basque last name. My grandfather was from the Basque Country up in Spain, and he immigrated to Cuba. And then my parents are both Cuban, and they immigrated to the United States. And then, of course, I'm first generation American. I lived in many different countries growing up because my dad worked for a computer company that sent him to many countries. So from the time I was 6 until the time I was 16, we lived in Italy, Puerto Rico, Mexico. And then when I was in college, I decided to go back to Mexico for a study abroad, wound up getting married, living there for 20 years, and then going back to the United States. So I've been kind of back and forth. My whole life has been kind of like the life of a gypsy going from one place to another. And it really kind of gave me that opportunity to kind of observe. I was always kind of like the outsider trying to figure out my environment around me. So I know what it's like being the new kid on the block and trying to figure stuff out. For any of you who have lived that kind of experience, you know how it is. You kind of go through a bit of culture shock here and there, assuming things are similar to where you come from, and then sadly finding out that you're making mistakes and you don't even realize it, right? So, and as a matter of fact, I just want to share a story with you of one of these funny cultural gaps. I remember I have 2 kids, and when my daughter was around, I want to say around 10 or 11 or 12, I can't remember. I remember we were living in Mexico, but we went back to Philadelphia for this summer to see my family. And I was meeting a colleague of mine. And you have to understand that in Mexico, greetings are very important. So you teach kids that when they meet somebody, especially an adult, they shake they put their hand out to shake the person's hand, and it's very important to make eye contact, smile. And usually the girls usually give the adult a kiss on the cheek, right? So that's just kind of like the background. So anyhow, so I introduced Lorena to Jim, my colleague and friend, and I kind of look away and I hear this nervous laugh. And then that afternoon, later that day, my daughter's like, "Oh my gosh, Mom, that was so embarrassing." I said, What happened? And she says, "When I went to say hello to your friend Jim, I shook his hand and I kind of leaned in to give him a kiss on the cheek. And he instinctively moved backwards. And all of a sudden, I was going to fall over. So I just grabbed him like a big bear hug. And so she said, I felt so embarrassed. And I started laughing. And she says, "Oh, my goodness, Mom, what? Did he say something to you?" And if anybody has a preteen daughter, you know how mortified they are of thinking that they made a fool of themselves, right? So she's like, "What did he say? What did he say?" So I said, "Well, Lorena, now I understand why when I left the house, my friend Jim said to me, "You know, your daughter Lorena, I kind of get the feeling that she really, really likes me." And so I just had to laugh, and my daughter just kind of like, she was kind of embarrassed, but she laughed as well. And I never had the heart to tell Jim that it wasn't that Lorena really liked him. It was just that she had to hang on for dear life to not fall on her face. So I mean, these are just, and again, these are things that when you think about cross-cultural interaction, from the get-go, you're at a disadvantage if you don't know what the rules of the game are, just even when it comes to greetings, how greetings can be just from there, not knowing whether you have to shake a hand or give a kiss or bow or what, you know? So, and by the way, I'm recommending a book called, it's actually called that, Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. And it's it gives you a little blurb about so many different countries and what to do and how to greet and what to do, what not to do, etc. So anyhow, so I thought I'd share that with you because it can be very confusing when we're interacting with people, even if they come from countries that speak the same language as we do. We tend to assume that they're just like us, but nothing could be further from the truth. And that's where sometimes we run into more difficulties because we're assuming a little too much. So my aim today, just like it was for Tuesday and will be for tomorrow, is to touch upon some of these things, some of these differences that can cause a lot of noise, and understand the whys, and see how we can find ways to bridge those differences, make our interactions a little easier. And again, the way that I'll be we'll be talking about on Tuesday, we talked about gender. Today, we're going to be talking about national and ethnic culture. And then, of course, tomorrow we'll be talking about generational culture. So we'll have a little bit of fun with that. So anyhow, okay, I have a couple of slides that are similar to Tuesdays because I think it's important to kind of review. So if you recall, we talked about what is culture, okay? And some of you said it's the things that we share in common, or it's our shared customs. And we kind of agreed that a very good definition is this one by Geert Hofstede, who's a famous interculturalist. So he talks about culture being the collective programming of our mind that distinguishes one group from another group. So it's very simple, and it's not just about ethnicity, it's not just about nationality, it's about a whole bunch of other different things. Like we said, even gender has its culture, our age has our culture, our industry has a culture, our race gives us a culture, our companies, our corporate culture. So it's basically something that we learn and we share with other people. So if it's something that you learn and share, it's probably a culture, almost like an onion. When we think about peeling back the different layers, right? And we probably don't have the exact culture as somebody else because there's going to be other groups that we belong to that somebody else might belong to, and we're not ever going to be a carbon copy of each other. Okay, and that brings us to the what we were talking about on Tuesday about how our culture defines a lot of our values, and how we can see culture as a lens through which we see things. So even though we might think that we're very objective in the way that we perceive things, perceive life, we're gonna have a lens which is going to be affecting the way that we experience things. And the thing is, most of the time we don't even realize that we have them on until we come across somebody who's behaving in a way that seems a little off to us, because what we've learned is one thing, and then maybe what we're observing in somebody else is another. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I think it's the easiest analogy that we can use to keep this in mind, so that we understand that, you know, if the girl with the blue lens is looking at the guy with the brown lens, you know, their perspective is going to be a little bit different. Okay. Okay, so remember the iceberg analogy where we talked about how there's certain elements of culture that are up on the top. That little 10% that's up on the top is usually the stuff that we can observe, or we can hear, we can taste, we can smell. It's the stuff that we can perceive through our 5 senses. So if you've ever gone to a different country, or even a different region within your own country. You know, if you're from the Northeast and you go down south or you go out west, there's going to be things that you're going to be able to perceive just by your five senses. From the time that you touch down, you can start looking at around, and you see everything from whether it's more arid or what the temperature's like, the infrastructure, general protocol, how people say hello to you, how their accents sound or the language they're speaking, their race, what's their racial makeup, what do they look like, how do they dress. So all of these things are those observable elements, right? But the biggest part of culture is the stuff that's underneath, that's a little more subtle, okay? Things that take you a while to understand about different cultures. So things like eating, what time do you eat? I remember when I first came to Mexico, I would take my little kids out to eat, and it turned out that they wouldn't open for lunch until 1:30. And I was like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. It was like 12 o'clock and my kids were starving, I was starving, and there wasn't a restaurant that would open until 1:30. So just that's like an example, or how you consider family something that's just your immediate family, your nuclear family, or do you consider your extended family? So part of your family in that you interact often with them. Eye contact. I can tell you so many stories about eye contact. I was coaching a woman in Mexico, an American woman she was kind of unhappy because she thought that she was committing some kind of mistake socially or culturally, because she would say to me, Maria, wherever I go, I feel like people are staring at me, and I don't know if it's because I'm doing something wrong. And I had to tell her, Lori, the whole concept of staring, as a matter of fact, the word stare does not have a direct translation in Spanish. And she's like, you're kidding me. I said, no, there's no word for stare in Spanish. There's just, you can look at someone fixedly or look at someone directly, but there's no word for stare. So what you associate as a negative connotation with the word stare doesn't exist in Latin American countries. So it's not considered rude to just kind of look at somebody curiously and be like, gee, I wonder what their story is. So if you want to verify that, just smile at them. You'll see they'll smile back and just continue looking at you. It's kind of like the curious stare or look of a child. There's no social taboo against staring. So these are just some of the things that, once you understand it, you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Okay, that changes things, right? So it's just one of those things where, and I'm sure many of you have probably run into things that are on the bottom part of the iceberg, and you can probably think of even funny stories that might even, that might even confirm what I'm saying. Okay, so any comments right now or questions? Feel free, by the way. Andy will be reading comments to me periodically as I pause, so that you can either make your comment, or I might throw out a question, or if you have a question, I'd love to hear from them as we go along. So any comments or observations until now that you have on anything I've said so far? Andy?
Not so far.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to grab just a few of the things that are underneath that iceberg, which usually we call them cultural dimensions. And there's tons of, if this is something that interests you, there are tons of resources out there of studies that have been made. One of the most famous ones was by Geert Hofstede, the man that had the quote that I had in the beginning. It was called the IBM study back in 1980, where he he pretty much surveyed all of the employees from IBM back in the day, back in the 80s, and came out with like 4 dimensions. And then there's other interculturalists like Franz Trompenaars, Edward Hall, and they all they grab all the countries and they kind of graph them according to these values or dimensions. So I'm going to be talking first about this concept of hierarchy and equality, okay? So we can see that in certain cultures, you have a very kind of vertical pyramid where there's lots of layers. In some cultures, it might even be a reflection of the way that the social hierarchy is developed. If it's a very classist culture or a very class-oriented, structured culture, you're going to have a much more vertical pyramid than if you have a more egalitarian, large middle class. You know, sometimes if you look at the social makeup of different cultures, if you have a big middle class, like for example in the United States, I would say it's more like a diamond shape where you have the very wealthy up on top is a small proportion, and the very poor down on the bottom, and then the big middle, like in the diamond, is kind of like the way that our society is set up. And then you've got more of a pyramid in many Latin American cultures and in Asian cultures. You can find that the power might be a little bit more centralized. You have a tiny upper class, maybe a small middle class, and then a very large lower middle or poor class. And many times you can see that socially that has an impact. It doesn't always mean that in a work environment it's going to be the same way, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But when we talk about work environments and what you learn in your work environment, it will probably imitate whatever it is that you have been brought up in. So in a hierarchical culture, you find that the power is usually up on top. It's pretty controlled and structured, and there's a very big importance given to seniority. So usually the managers tend to be older. They're expected to be specialists, experts in everything. They're supposed to have the answers for everything, and oftentimes are the ones making the decisions. And you're not supposed to jump over your immediate boss to get answers. It's kind of like you have to go through the ranks, go through all the layers, right? Whereas in more egalitarian types of organizations, it's a little more decentralized. There's a lot more, maybe they're more matrices, a lot of dotted lines. There's a structure that tries to promote autonomy and responsibility. And usually your manager is seen as another member of the team, just with a certain amount of authority. And you can even disagree with them and have a different input, and that's totally okay. So if we look at some of the different countries that fall under more hierarchical structure, you can see them there. And of course, this is just a handful of them. There's all kinds of charts that tell you many more countries and where they fall on the hierarchical line. And then, of course, you can see the more egalitarian countries on the right there. Okay. Now, there's something to be said about the types of hierarchy and what we mean, because if you just look at it one-dimensionally, this is it. But if you look at it from a deeper perspective, what you can see is that there's two different elements. Okay, so sometimes you can look at the element regarding decision making on the one hand, and there you can see the top-down versus consensual. And then on the other hand, authority. On the left you have the more egalitarian countries, on the right you have the more hierarchical countries. Okay, and here I'd like to just share a story. I was doing a training for an American manager who was living and working in Mexico at the time, and one of his difficulties or challenges, as you can see, United States is on the left side, it's top down, and Mexico's on the right side, it's more hierarchical. And he would say to me, Maria, I'm having difficulty because I tell people what my expectations are, what results we're looking for, but I tend to have people coming back to me constantly and asking me, is this okay? Is this okay? How do you want this? How do you want that? He says, and I'm not used to that, and I'm getting a little frustrated because I feel like people are just delegating upward and nobody wants to take, responsibility, or nobody wants to be accountable. Okay, so I had to explain to him that in Mexico, the leadership style tends to be more top-down and more hierarchical, in the sense that people are a little reluctant to just kind of go ahead and do their own thing, because the process is usually tightly controlled from the top levels. It's more centralized. So it would be considered, I guess, a bit disrespectful to just kind of, go ahead and make my own decisions without consulting the boss. So I told him, I said, look, the leader is the one who establishes what the culture is. So if you want to change your internal culture, what you're going to have to do is start asking, when people want to delegate upward, you're going to have to start asking more open-ended questions and jump into a more coaching mode instead of just delegating. And if any of you know anything about situational leadership, there's different styles. Some focus more on the task, some focus more on relationship, and then different combinations. I said, so if you're used to just delegating with your American team, you're going to have to do a little more coaching with your Mexican team. And then, of course, give recognition whenever you find behaviors that are the ones that you want to see. So make sure that you're recognizing when somebody takes the initiative, and when somebody comes to you and says, hey, John, is this right? Then you just kind of say, okay, well, what do you think? What are the benefits of this? Or how do you think this is going to help? Or, I'm going to leave that up to you, kind of like do a little bit more coaching, or, hey, I trust you. I think you're going to be, just come and tell me what the results are, whatever. I said, but it has to be a little bit more dialoguing in the beginning before you just let people go, because otherwise people feel like you're just abandoning them, or if they think, instead of thinking that no news is good news, people might think no news is bad news. So you got to take that into account as well. Okay, so that's and I don't know if maybe I'm going to stop right here. Is this an issue that any of you have faced as far as like the perception of hierarchy? I'm going to leave a couple seconds while you guys write, and I'm just going to say one more thing, and then Andrea, if you see any comments or questions, let me know. Okay, so I'm going to look. If you look at the top left quadrant, for example, in the U.S., decisions, when decisions are made, they're kind of like with a small d. So usually there won't be an expectation that we achieve a consensus in our team, but once a decision is made, and it could be that the boss decides, you might get some input, and then the boss might decide something. There's a certain expectation that we all have to align. It's like, okay, we got to align, quick decision, and the decision might change. So there might be other input that might affect the decision. So people feel the need to be flexible, but you're expected to align even after you've been heard out. You align and you go on and move ahead. Okay, the top right quadrant, for example, you might have, for example, like in Mexico or China, the boss may or may not ask for input. But once a decision is made, it's not open to discussion, and everybody just has to follow suit. And it's pretty much. And if the decision changes, you have to just go along with it. Now, looking down on the bottom left quadrant, for example, I don't know, the Netherlands, the boss is considered more of a facilitator and wants to get everybody's input. It's much more consensual. You have to make sure that everybody has their say. But there you're going to find that once the decision is made, it's with a capital D, okay, and the decision is sacred because it's become a consensus. So there's no changing at the last minute. So you're not going to have you usually won't have somebody coming in and trying to change the rules on you. Like the boss won't be like, oh, I think maybe we'll do it this way. So since it takes a longer time, once a decision is made, everybody sticks by it. People aren't so keen to, change things at the last minute because it's taken such a long time to finally achieve the consensus. Okay, and then on the right-hand side, you can see that it's also more of a consensual style of hierarchy where people will also sit down, talk about it, and you lobby. For example, in Japan, there's like, you'll grab, there'll be like a group of maybe mid-level managers. They'll reach a consensus, they'll lobby, and then they'll go up to the next level and lobby, and then until it gets up to the higher level. But they'll never disagree openly. Whatever they do, it has to be done in smaller groups, lobbying, kind of getting people on board, and then going up to the next level. And that's how decisions get made. Even though there's a very high respect for authority, the way the decisions are made tend to be a lot more consensual. Okay. Okay. So, any comments come up, Andy, or any questions?
So far, so good. We have some active listeners.
Active listeners. Okay, great. And feel free if you disagree with anything, or hey, I've had this other experience and I don't know about that. Feel free also. Any comments or criticisms are also open. Okay. Okay. So this is important because you know what? If you are a manager who's from a different country and you come to the U.S., or you're an American manager and you have to do a stint somewhere else, or if you have to work with people from different cultures, you have to remember that not everybody's going to perceive leadership in the same way. And we've got anything from, I feel like I'm being micromanaged, to somebody feeling like, my boss is totally neglecting me. So it's the lens. It's the lens of what we share and what we've learned, of our expectations. And we've got expectations probably in the hierarchical group of, you as a leader or as a manager knowing everything. Whereas on the left, you as a leader are not expected to know everything. You're another contributing member of the team, and it's okay to not have the answers. Okay. Now, one of my favorite, this is one of my favorite topics, but then again, I guess I have a lot of them because I love this stuff. But one of the things that is also very interesting is this dimension of doing versus being, which is also sometimes called task versus relationship, so that it's a little easier to understand. Okay, so there are cultures that are very much define themselves based on what I do and what I achieve, whereas there's other cultures that define themselves through their circle of people, their in-group, who they belong to, who their friends are, and of course, the way that you might define success might be affected by this as well, right? So on the one hand, if you're more in the doing or task orientation, there's a sense, especially at work, that business takes precedence over relationships. I don't really care anything about your personal life as long as we can get the job done. And you'll hear people say, you know what, I'm not here at work to make friends. I'm just here to do my job, and I don't have to like you. We just have to get stuff done. So it's all about, doing your job, getting the results. A relationship might develop as a byproduct, but not necessarily. Okay, and short-term relationships can be quite common. Okay, then on the other hand, we have the being or relationship orientation. Okay, where it's really important for me, if I don't like you, but at very least, it's very important that I not dislike you in order to do my job. So I have to have at least some kind of sense of solidarity, camaraderie, if you like, to be able to do a good job. Because if I really dislike you, it's going to be very hard for me to work with you. Okay, relationship is kind of important in the process, and there's a very high value on loyalty, taking one for the team, and kind of keeping harmony within your group. So, for example, I'll give you an example. When I was working in the U.S., there were like 12 of us in a customer service job, and we all kind of sat together, but when lunch came, everybody kind of like did their own thing. And unless you made an appointment with one of your colleagues, hey, you want to have lunch tomorrow? Or hey, you want to have lunch? No, sorry, I got to run out to the pharmacy. Or no, I'm just going to have a sandwich at my desk. So there wasn't this push to kind of have lunch with my close colleagues, and everybody just did their own thing. And I would drive. I was very close to home, so I would just drive home, get something to eat, and come back. So there was kind of like this very, everyone was kind of like a little individualistic. Here in Mexico, and by the way, I'm in Mexico at the moment. So, so in Mexico, my experience has been that whatever group you belong to, so if you're in the billing team, everybody will just kind of go down to the cafeteria together. Everybody goes and has lunch together. If somebody's on the phone, everybody will wait around for that person until they've hung up, and then everybody just kind of walks together, or they try to sit together, or take a walk together. So the sense of being together is more important than what I might particularly want to eat or do that day. So, and it doesn't mean you have to do it every day, but there's kind of like an expectation that if you never come and hang out with us at lunch, then there's some unspoken message that you're sending, a certain rejection. Okay, so that's just something that I have observed in my experience. So we can see here, for example, which countries tend to be a little bit more task-oriented, a little more, individualistic, and then the cultures that tend to be a little bit more being relationship-oriented, a little more collectivistic. Okay, so it kind of goes hand in hand.
Maria?
Yes?
We have a comment and a question.
Okay.
Okay, so one of our comments related to this area would be, I have worked and lived in different countries and feel it is the most important and most difficult aspect of the job to continuously adjust to different countries and the company culture, or a combination of the two.
Okay, yes, it's difficult, and it's kind of one of these survival skills that you have to learn, because otherwise you feel like you're swimming against the current. So yes, I agree, and it's something that we have to learn. You said you had a question also?
You do. One question is, or the question is, how do you handle it when you see a relationship that starts affecting the task?
Okay, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but I'm thinking maybe if you feel that somebody's taking advantage of your friendship, maybe, and trying to kind of gain a benefit from that. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So that could be tough, because you know what? More relationship-oriented cultures tend to also be, there kind of comes this expectation of, I do you a favor, you do me a favor, and and sometimes that trumps the rules, or that trumps, that might be the rule for everybody else, but since I'm your buddy, then I kind of get a free pass. So I would say that in that sense, I would say you kind of have to face it head on, and maybe especially bring up the fact, or in the name of the relationship, say, listen, I like you, you're my friend, but I'm going to ask you please not to put me in a difficult situation, and I'm approaching you due to the trust and the friendship that I have, and so that you can be considerate also to my situation. So you kind of revert back to the relationship. So you kind of throw it back at the other person and say, hey, if you care for me and our friendship, please consider this and this and that, or please don't put me in this situation. So it's a matter of also being able to face conflict in a very benign way before conflict gets to a second or third level. So that would be my suggestion. And hey, I know you don't realize this, but when you ask me to do this, it puts me in a bind, and I don't want to be seen as being, playing favorites, or I'm going to ask you as a friend to please consider my position as well. You can throw it back that way. So I don't know if that answers the question. Now, another thing I was going to say about the being or relationship orientation is that you'll find that people in this orientation, sometimes it's harder for them to say no because they don't want to lose face. So they'll say yes, yes, yes to you, and then because they want to be nice and they say what they think you want to expect, and also they might ask more questions. It's not that they're being nosy, so they might say, oh, so how many kids do you have? Oh, and are you married? Oh, so a lot of these countries will, you'll find that people from more relationship or being oriented cultures will ask more personal questions. And it's not to be nosy. It's just because they want to find some common ground in order to kind of feel that camaraderie or loyalty and find what they have in common with you. And it's a way to kind of cement that understanding and just feel like, okay, you're a good person and I can kind of relate to you and I know what you're going through. So yeah, I feel like I get you. So that's something that's kind of interesting. And then on the other hand, it can be perceived that if you're a little too task or doing oriented, that you're kind of cold and you're not, you might feel snubbed because you're not really, you just go in the morning, you don't even say hello to me, you just go directly into business, you don't break the ice. So it's kind of important that you realize if you identify with one side or the other, just how the other side might see you. And it's because they've got a green lens and you have a brown lens or a purple lens, okay? That's it. It's just how you learned to do things and how they learned to do things. And again, remember that respect, the concept of respect is universal. But how you show it is gonna be so different. There's gonna be so many different colors. So just keep that in mind, okay? So far, so good? Okay, yes. Now we get into the topic of communication. This is the one that usually trips everybody up, okay? So we usually have, when we talk about the impact of a message, we usually talk about the three elements, right? We've got words, we've got tone, and we've got the nonverbal, okay? Now, those three elements make 100% of the impact of a message. I would ask you, and just quickly just type it down, which one of these three do you think is the one that has the most impact when we're talking? Words, tone, or nonverbal? Which is the most impactful? And Andy, if people write it down, can you tell me what they say?
Tone.
Okay.
Either have responded with tone, a few more with nonverbal.
Okay. Okay.
Tone,
so
they're tied.
Okay, tone and nonverbal are tied. Okay, yes, they're very close. As you can see, words only make up 7% of the impact of a message, whereas the tone and nonverbal make up the other 93%. Okay, and this, by the way, holds true probably for any country. For any country. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody expresses themselves openly in the same way. Okay, because also you can think of there's another dimension called expressive versus instrumental. Expressive means that you show your emotions, that you wear your emotions on a sleeve, okay? Instrumental means that you're a poker face, that you don't show your emotions so easily, okay? Now, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, as a Latin woman, and believe me, my parents are Cuban, so yes, we tend to be kind of loud. That's kind of like part of our characteristics. And I don't know if maybe we have cochlear issues, but we do tend to be loud and very emotional. It's one of these characteristics that we tend to have. Whereas, you usually you hear, the archetype of a Brit is that, the typical stiff upper lip. And if you watch a lot of those period pieces on BBC, yes, you're kind of like, just tell them you love them already, or just cry. And they're always very, very proper, But there's a lot to be said also about how much you show and how you use your tone and nonverbal. and what your culture says you should or should not do. Okay. Now it's very interesting because in a lot of the studies that have been done, you can see how in certain cultures, like for example, the Japanese or the Chinese, they'll smile or maybe laugh to hide distress or anger or embarrassment. And maybe for a Westerner, it'd be like, why are you laughing, or why are you smiling at this? And it's just a way to kind of like control maybe the body language or not fall into a negative form of body language. Again, because maybe your cultural norm tells you how appropriate it is to show a negative emotion versus a positive emotion. And we can also see this if we think back to Tuesday, how emotion is perceived if a woman shows it versus a man, you know. And you have to think about maybe how you need to, like, how reining back on negative emotion has to do with trying to keep harmony. And that can be true whether it's for a different culture or a gender or whatever. So think about what you've learned growing up. You know, if you were taught, you know, I don't know, little boys don't cry, or, you know, don't be a baby or whatever. Or if, you know, I remember here in Mexico hearing, you know, if you get angry, you lose. So ironically, even though they say, oh, Latinos wear the emotion on their sleeve, there's certain emotions that might be more open, like euphoria or happiness or sadness. But anger is not one of those emotions that can be expressed equally in all of the Latin American cultures. And I would say here in Mexico, it's kind of taboo. People kind of have to keep a poker face when they're angry. Whereas in Argentina, you can, or Cuba, you can, you know, show that you're angry and it's okay, and people won't take it personally. Because again, showing anger, and in Japan especially, you know, it's kind of like you're losing face and you're making everybody else lose face. And there was an experiment where they had Japanese and Americans watching a movie, and it was like it had some strong scenes in it. When Americans would watch it either by themselves or with the researcher, they made the same, like they would make the, you know, the faces like horrified or whatever. And the Japanese, when they were by themselves, they'd make their faces, but when they observed, they would be a lot more kind of like poker faced, more guarded. So it's very interesting to see how you perceive the expectations of what you can and cannot show. And that will vary also from culture to culture. Okay. Now, if we add to that something that's called context. Now, can anybody tell me what they understand by context? Do I have any takers? What is context? Anybody want to give me a definition? Nobody? Nobody wants to have a go at it? Andy?
We do have a reply. Situation?
Okay, a situation. Okay. Okay, yes.
Surrounding the subject.
Okay, when you ground a subject, so it's all of the information, all of the additional information that can give more meaning to a message. Okay, so when we talk about context, it could be my previous history with you, who's present, whether there's there's X person or Y person present, whether there's an issue of hierarchy, how I use silences or pauses. All of that is kind of like the reading between the lines. So context is like the reading between the lines. And it's very interesting because studies show that there are cultures that don't really give that much importance to reading between the lines. They'll just kind of go with the, you know, with the impact of the message and whatever that is. And then there's high context cultures where there's a lot of reading between the lines. So you could kind of compare it with like rabbit ears antenna versus a parabolic antenna. So the lower context you are, the less interpreting you're going to be doing when you receive a message. And if you're high context, it means that you're probably going to do a lot more analyzing and interpreting of what's actually being said. Okay, so if you're more low context, you tend to you tend to consider that the responsibility for getting that message understood lies with the sender. So I better be very clear because my primary objective is information. So, I might say, hey, Andrea, I got your report, but you know what? That's not really going to help me because I actually needed variables X, Y, and Z explained in more detailed. Do you think you could do it over for me, please? Okay, so it's just very task center, a little bit more personal. I just tell Andy what I need, and there will be no doubt as to what I want, and she will understand. And I expect her to say what she thinks. So if she has any objection, she's going to speak up and say, Maria, I don't have that information. I can't put it in a different format for you. Or you know what, I'm kind of busy right now. I'll give it to you tomorrow. Or sure, no problem. I can do this within the next couple of hours, whatever. But it's just a very straightforward type of communication. On the other hand, we've got the high context where the responsibility for getting the message understood lies with the receiver. Why? Because the person who's sending the message is going to be concerned first and foremost about the relationship. And again, usually it aligns with more being and relationship-oriented cultures. Okay, so before I even open my mouth, I'm going to think, man, if I tell Andy that the report she gave me was no good for me, she might feel bad because she really spent time on it, and I don't want her to feel like I don't want her to think that I'm saying that she's incompetent. So maybe I'm going to think of all that, and I'm going to edit before I open my mouth, and I'm going to say, Andy, thanks for that report. I know you must have spent a lot of time on it. It's very complete in certain aspects, but I'm wondering if you could also please add variables X, Y, and Z, because those are the ones that I really need for this project. Okay, so you can see how I'm kind of softening it up, trying to give her a certain recognition before I jump in and tell her, you know what, and if she has her big antenna, she's going to understand that the report was no good. I need this other thing. Okay, now the problem is when one person has really tiny antenna and the other one has really big antenna, if Andy has little antenna, she's going to hear that like, oh, it would be a nice to have, but it's not a necessary have. Okay, whereas if it's the other way around, if she's high context and I'm low context, and I say, hey, Andy, what you gave me is no good. It doesn't have the variables that I need. She's going to be kind of offended, and she's going to be like, man, that was kind of mean. Didn't Maria's parents teach her that, she should be a little nicer when giving feedback? So again, we have our different color lens on how we say things, how we give feedback, how we deal with conflict. Okay, because if I'm more high context, I'm gonna understand a lot more of what you mean by what you don't say, but rather that you infer. And if I'm on the other side, I'm not going to get it. It's going to go right over my head. And by the way, thinking back to our Tuesday keynote, can you guess? Usually, again, all of these things are generalizations. They're not absolutes. But can you guess in general what category women fall into versus men? Higher or lower context? Anybody?
Higher context.
Okay, yes. Yes, star for those who said it. It means you were listening. Okay, so you can see that, again, if it's learned and shared, as women, we tend to learn a little bit more high contexting. In cultures, again, and for many different reasons, many are historical. There are cultures where it's very important to keep harmony in relationships. So people are going to be a lot more careful about how they say things. Other cultures might be a lot more pragmatic, and it doesn't mean that people are rude in low context cultures. It just means that their priority is the information or the task, and secondary is the relationship. Whereas in high context cultures, my primary objective or my priority is the relationship, and my second priority is the information, because things get done in high context cultures through relationships. You can't alienate anybody, or else you won't get things done. And they tend to be more collective cultures, by the way. Here you can see which cultures tend to be more high context and which tend to be more low context. Okay, kind of interesting. Now, if you look at the context, this high context and low context, you also have another chart that shows you whether one thing is like the input, so the high and low context is your antenna, and then the horizontal line is the output, whether you give feedback, whether you kind of have the bravery of telling somebody the truth that, hey, this is no good, your report is no good, or if you're a little bit more diplomatic about it. So interestingly, you can see that even though the US is more low context, we're not as direct as some other cultures are. So, you've got the Scandinavians and the Dutch, they tend to be they don't hold back punches. We're kind of like very close. We're kind of like on that border, okay? But we try to be a little bit nice. But like, for example, the Brits are a lot more nice. They're a lot more diplomatic than we are, okay? And then if you see on the bottom, you can see high context and indirect, okay? You can see a lot of cultures on that side of the spectrum that tend to be like, and by the way, I don't agree with the Argentina. I would say between Argentina and Mexico, you can see Argentina is a little more to the left than Mexico. I would say it's even more than that. I would say it's probably closer to the B quadrant. I can't tell you how many times I've been called in to do cross-cultural sessions with different people from Latin America, and you think everybody kind of falls under the same, roof, but wow, that's why I say sometimes you think that people from the countries that speak your same language are similar to you, and the problem is that when you're unpleasantly surprised, a lot of conflict can come up because your supposition gets totally thrown out the window. Okay, and then of course you've got quadrant B where people tend to be more high context, so they can catch what's going on, but at the same time they will tell you, hey, I have to give you a little pushback here, or this isn't really right. Okay, so that's kind of how it goes, and I have an example here. So like kind of like the example that I gave. Okay, so the report's incomplete. That's a low context statement, and it's very direct. Okay, what would an indirect message sound like? It might sound something like this. Okay, incorporating all aspects of the report can be tricky. Some of the things that are important are past trends, performance issues, and overall efficiency. That's why we need to make sure everything is included. So it's a very indirect way of saying this report is incomplete, but I'm kind of being nice, and I'm kind of like first person plural, okay? So, these are things you kind of have to keep in mind when you're talking to people, okay? Because you might be establishing an expectation that's different from what the other person has because they have a different color lens. So as far as some suggestions that I might have is make sure at the beginning of a project that you're kind of establishing your expectations. And this goes, I think this is true for any time you have a new project or a new team. So make sure you're not micromanaging people on the one hand who tend to be a lot more task oriented, or being too hands off with people who tend to be a little bit more relationship oriented or more egalitarian or more hierarchical. Okay, so make sure that you know what is expected of you as a team member or as a leader. Okay, important to give a lot of feedback and follow up. Okay, so the second one is remember that trust is developed differently. In a more task-oriented culture, it's going to be developed through dependability. So if I know that you follow through and you get things done, I trust you. Whereas in a more relationship-oriented, I'm going to trust you more because I feel like you open up to me and you have my back and I feel the camaraderie. So think about that and how trust is developed. Now, this one on conflict management, in some cultures, conflict might be managed in a more direct way, so don't be offended if you're more high context. People aren't meaning to be mean. If you're low context, conflict might be managed by others in a more diplomatic, roundabout way. Don't think the person's two-faced. They're just trying to save face, both yours and theirs. And that obviously brings us to the first few slides we saw. Remember that you have been raised by different parents in a different environment. So therefore, you're going to have a different color lens. So if you judge somebody else, remember they're going to be judging you just right back. So remember that that's something you have to keep in mind. Okay? Okay. So I'm opening it up to questions. Does anybody have any comments or questions? We have a few minutes left.
We do have one comment.
Okay.
It reads, in my experience, the Brits and the Americans from the South are equally focused on being nice.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think people, if you look even at the United States is a huge country, I would say probably people in the North tend to be more low context people in the South. If you're focusing on relationships, you're more high context. So you pick up on what people are feeling, and you might make sure, you know what, if you give a lot of importance to courtesy and being polite, you're more relationship oriented. So that for sure is a very good observation.
And then a question would be, what are your thoughts if you inadvertently offend someone? What steps should you take?
Oh, good question. I'll tell you, I offended a lot of people when I lived here in Mexico because I didn't realize I was like an elephant in a china shop. So sometimes I never even had the benefit of knowing that I had offended somebody because it's kind of difficult. If sometimes I would depend on somebody to be kind of like my intermediary and tell me, hey, your friend Anna, she's kind of upset because you said this and this and that. And what I would do is I would just straight out say, hey, listen, I have a tendency to be very direct. And I know that can be a little shocking. So I want to apologize if I've ever been a little too direct. I'm aware of that. It's, I'm not Mexican though, so I know that.
Thank you so much, Maria. We look forward to your message tomorrow.
Thank you. Take care.